Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hatchery 101's webinar today. My name is Ben Normand, and I will be your host and moderator for today's discussion on alternative ingredients. Sustainability means investigating ways to future-proof all aspects of our hatchery operations. Fish meal and fish oil supply for feed ingredients are becoming more challenging every year. Today, we've brought together experts to talk about the latest innovations in alternative feed ingredients. First, before we introduce everyone here, though, I'd like to acknowledge the sponsor of this webinar series, Oxyguard International, without which this webinar series would not be possible. Now to introduce our panelists, we have Annette Bernsten, who's the Business Development Manager of Novel Ingredients for Skretting AI, Gareth Butterfield, who's the Commercial Director at ReelData Incorporated, previously with Cargill, and we have Wendy Sealey, who's a nutritionist with the USDA Agriculture Research Service. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for taking the time to talk to us today. Now, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available to those who wish to have it within 48 hours. As well, to our viewers, I'd like to remind you, if you haven't been here before, that it's made up of two parts. We have our structured questions to the panelists for the first roughly half hour, 40 minutes. And then in the last portion, we'll switch to answer audience questions. So to that end, I would like to invite anybody attending today to please use the Q&A function in your Zoom window here to submit questions throughout the webinar, and we can get to those at the end. And I would encourage you, as questions come up, submit them as we go, because the number of questions that we have there certainly helps to determine when we switch over to audience questions. All right, well, without further ado, let's get started, everybody. So for the first question here, let's go to Annette, and we'll say alternative ingredients is a term we hear thrown around a lot. What does it really mean?
Well, and thank you. Thank you for putting this webinar together and also to highlighting this very important topic. So alternative ingredients is absolutely, as you say, thrown around. And I think we have to start by identifying alternative to what and why. So driven by future demand, we need to scout for alternative ingredients to replace or reduce the reliance on traditional ingredients we use, like marine sources. And as a guidance, when we scout or look for alternatives, of course, we have to meet the nutritional, environmental, and economic criteria. So that's in general what's meant by alternative. Getting into more specific, for Skretting, we have recently rethought and defined novel ingredients or alternative ingredients. And we've also highlighted at scale, because that's where we see the challenge in terms of alternative ingredients. We need to get them in scale so we can utilize them. And we also would like it to be guided by with the potential of expanding and enhancing our feed offerings. So that's in short, alternative ingredients.
Great, thank you very much. Wendy, perhaps we can leave with you on this one. Why do we need to be looking beyond the traditional ingredients that we've worked with in the past?
Well, I mean, there's the obvious ones in terms of just the quantities that we're going to need in the future. That there's some real challenges of our traditional ingredients, both our wild caught and our more traditional terrestrial ingredients that we've relied upon. The competition for those ingredients and the scale that we hope aquaculture grows to are going to require so much more than those can provide. We also have a lot of other reasons that we should be looking to some of the more non-traditional, if we can call them. I mean, getting back to Annette's comment on alternatives, that term to me is pretty outdated at this point. I mean, and it, like she talks about, it's being thrown around. It's definitely overused, and I think it's simply because we don't have a better word for describing them. But I don't think the term alternative ingredients even really fits with how we do modern fish feed formulation, aqua feed, and nutrition, because we have such a more diverse suite of ingredients than we ever have had in the past. So the term of an alternative gets back to exactly what Annette said in terms of alternative to what. All right, so that's my sidetrack on that one. But coming back, I think the scale issue is a primary reason we have to look beyond. But then additionally, our markets are demanding that we look beyond some of our traditional ones, because there's that term that's thrown, when we know better, we do better. And so as we learn about some of our traditional ingredients and how they're being produced in different ways, some of which might not be the way we want them to be produced in our future markets. So we have to look at identifying ingredients that can fit into our modern feeds, whether they be more sustainable, whatever the sustainability criteria are. We need to look at how our market wants those ingredients to be used in different applications. They might not want certain ingredients in our aquaculture feeds. They might want those used for humans instead. So we have to look at how our product streams are used in relation to what our markets are demanding. So we have a lot more criteria than just how it fits into the nutritional needs of the animal, and that's good and bad. So,
and if I could build on that a little bit, Ben, as well, I think another reason to look at this is the commercial viability of new ingredients. So I'm actually really pleased nobody's jumped to the stock answer of, hey, world capture fisheries has plateaued at 95 million metric tons, El Nino events. There's a lot more things happening in the world today that's affecting raw material sourcing and availability. A few years ago, we had the Suez Canal incident, which created absolute chaos for sourcing of raw materials. But not only that, we had a massive shortage of containers to be able to get those raw materials to facilities. There's the Ukrainian war. And again, you think about the Ukrainian war in Russia, well, what does that mean? Well, it's a large source of rapeseed oil or canola oil, wheat as well. So I think it's really looking about, reducing the amount of volatility, the wider the raw material basket that's available to us that is safe and responsibly sourced, the better we can do in terms of predictability. Because the reality is whatever becomes expensive to fish feed suppliers essentially goes straight through to the farmers. And, unpredictability in pricing and costs, it's the largest cost of any farming company. So we need to make sure that, even if it's expensive, can we predict that? So there has to be some reasonable predictive assumptions around it. And the only way we're going to get to that is through consistency of supply.
Thank you very much, everyone. And on that note about predictability here, how does a changing climate propel or affect our need and ability to develop these? And I have it here written alternative ingredients, but I'm just going to call them ingredients now. Annette, if you wouldn't mind leading on this one, that'd be great. Thanks.
No, but I think, it's also building on the answers already given. We have a planet to feed, and we need to find alternatives or novel or other resources so that we can feed with proteins that have a lower footprint. I think that's the main driver. And as we see now, the climate changes, the sense of urgency is arising. So I think that's the main driver.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'll add to that one as well, Ben, if you don't mind. So again, it's the extreme weather events that we're seeing. So again, over the past few years, so prior to my time with ReelData working in Cargill, I was heavily involved in raw material sourcing, the formulation, production of the feed as well. And we started to see both droughts and floods in the same areas that were producing plant proteins. These are things that we've never experienced before in the past. So in addition to the things I've already mentioned around world events, we're seeing much more extreme weather patterns that's preventing that predictability again of the raw material sourcing and where we can get it from. The world is changing dramatically at this point. So that consistency of supply comes back down to the climate aspect as well.
Yeah, and I'm going to just jump in here too. I mean, we're talking about consistency that applies, but you're also seeing changes in the ingredients themselves, right? So the climate is impacting the quality of some of our ingredients, and it's look at with some of these climatic events as alternatives because our ingredients are changing themselves. But at the same time, our fish are changing, right? Our fish are having to adapt to these environments. And so some ingredients and some formulations work better in these more extreme environments or help fish handle some of these challenges that they're facing as well. So I think we're going to see some changing ingredient streams to react both on the nutritional side for the fish, but also some of the shifting ingredient qualities as well. So that's just what I'd like to add to that part.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. In terms of adoption of these ingredients, pardon me, what are the main differences you've seen between hatcheries and grow-out operations? Wendy.
Yeah, so for me, this one is kind of gets back to some of our initial work and when alternate ingredient research really started. I mean, it's been going on since the beginning of aquaculture diets, right? So alternative ingredients have been being evaluated and been into formulation and tested from the time we started culturing fish. But I think what we see in some of the differences between the hatcheries and the grow out facilities gets back to our initial work at times, our need to use alternative ingredients and formulations preceded our knowledge of how to use them best. And at times, that risk of taking those alternate ingredients and using those formulations with increased amounts of those alternate ingredients was associated with price decreases. And so those cheaper formulations were associated with more risk to your production. And in a hatchery situation, you try to avoid that risk as much as possible. So our hatcheries in general, as the basis of the production scheme, would try to avoid that risk by buying less diets with less alternative ingredients historically. And I think that's just because of the evolution of the research. We're seeing some of that shift back now because we're getting more education, but I would argue that probably still our hatcheries are probably more resistant to alternative ingredients than grow out populations for that reason. But I'd like to hear the other guys' thoughts on that from the industry side, if that's what they're actually seeing. That's what, from my academic side, what I feel like is happening.
Yeah, certainly I can take a stab at this one. I think, I would categorize it down to nutrition and scale. So I think to your point, Wendy, there's definitely differences between the hatchery side and the ungrown side. On the nutritional side, we know that larger salmon, for example, are much more tolerant to higher levels of substitution. So we can get down to 0% fish meal in large salmon, whereas you could be at 20 or 25% in smaller fish. And that simply comes down to the nutritional requirements of smaller fish in general. So they have a higher demand for amino acids or good quality amino acids, a higher demand for the omega-3s, the DHA, EPA characteristics as well. And the same goes for other species, right? Whether it's in the terrestrial agriculture space or your pets, you don't feed the puppy the same thing as you do a grown dog, or, be it poultry, pigs, cattle, ourselves as adults, right? We can pound a few McDonald's burgers without it having too big of an effect, but we're not going to give those to our children, or we shouldn't at least, not too often. And then I think as well, the second part for me is the scale. One of the issues that we see from a tactical approach in feed industry is, okay, if it's only applicable to the hatchery side, how do we get these raw material suppliers to get up to scale? It actually adds a huge layer of complexity in a feed production system. Sorry, we have a storm going through and something has just blown off my balcony. It distracted me for a second. Yeah, so in the feed production system, if you have only a small amount of raw material coming in for the hatchery phase, it adds complexity in terms of we need smaller silos, smaller bins. It usually adds cost again. So for the scale, I really think we need to see some level of unity between what's happening in the hatchery phase and what's happening in the ungrown phase. But the scale is going to come much faster for those ongrowing species, ongrown phases of each species. And I think the last piece I would point to is regulation. So within Canada, for the CFIA, for example, they would have different allowances of certain raw materials between the hatchery phase and the ongrown stage of the same species as well. So that's a rabbit hole that we shouldn't get down today. But again, it causes frustrations, confusions, and concerns around, well, what should I be using for this particular species and at which stage of the life cycle as well?
Something interesting that you guys have touched on a few times already here, and this idea of, even calling them alternative ingredients. And Wendy, you touched on this too, and it's really intriguing, and I'm just enjoying kind of chewing on this one is, at some point, every ingredient that's not fish meal directly was technically an alternative ingredient, right? Everything was new. Any blood meal was an alternative ingredient at some point, or any additive really. at what point, and this is not an actual answerable question, I don't think, but it's interesting to think about, at what point does it stop being alternative and just become an ingredient, right? And in that way, is anything alternative truly, so interesting for sure. Generally, we're always talking about alternative ingredients for salmonid feeds, ingredients. What successes are we seeing in other species? Gareth, maybe you can comment on this.
Sure, and actually, you set me up well for this one, Ben. To be honest, because you said, like, at which point does it not become an alternative or a novel ingredient? So what we're seeing so certainly North America, my background in the Canadian, the US aqua nutrition industry for 7 years before I joined ReelData. There's a little bit of a lag over where salmon feed and nutrition innovation and advancements have been. But we fed out of the EWAS Canada facility striped bass, Seriola, tilapia, sturgeon. And the reality is we can apply some of the learnings from salmon into those other species as well. It tends to happen at a slower rate because some of these new species, they're just emerging. There's a little bit of hesitation around both the speed of adoption, but also the confidence level as, hey, do we want to step outside of our comfort zone at this stage until the actual fish producers have scale and they're comfortable in making those changes as well? I think you overlay that as well on the back of actually not fully understanding the nutritional requirement of some of the new species. So alternative species or novel species coming in, you could have the same argument, at which point are they not are no longer considered alternative or novel as well. So I think we've seen some good advancements moving away from fish meal, fish oil only diets to land animal proteins, to the inclusion of high protein concentrates like soy. You can get sunflower concentrates now as well, corn gluten concentrate. So those things are already happening, but they're just not happening at the same rate. But these species are also at the infancy of their production as well. So it will happen. It's just going to take a little bit longer, in my opinion.
Mm-mm. And also, if I may comment, you see, and I think we have to be realistic, that the willingness to pay is greater within the salmon industry. So that's, there needs to be a request, and there need to be a willingness to invest, to do the trials and to do the research.
And that's probably the same across a lot of sectors, not even just ours, where sort of early adopters tend to be the well-resourced ones, right? And so because there's an inherent risk there for sure. I'm going to pivot just a little bit here. It's fairly connected, but I remember hearing this great story about the old guys I'm in Prince Edward Island, right? And for a while they didn't want to switch from fuses to breakers in their electrical panels, right? And they said, oh, they just start fires. But then it came out that a lot of the guys whose houses were catching on fire, they didn't like that the breakers broke and did their job. And so they were shoving pennies in there to stop them from doing it, right? So really, they were completely disabling the ability of the breaker to do its job correctly, and therefore didn't see the benefit. So sometimes we're not able to kind of clearly see the advancement for what it is. And to that end, Annette, if you could lead on this one, would be great. As we explore and trial these ingredients, what have you seen as the sort of major challenges to success in adoption? You kind of touched on one in terms of resources, but have you seen anything else out there?
Well, I think we're heading towards a very exciting decade. So if you look back for the last 10 years, a lot of things have been happening within novel ingredients / alternative / new, and we can learn from that. So I think that also when you look at the challenges or the bottlenecks that have been identified and are kind of slowing down the utilization is absolutely already mentioned. Aquaculture requires constant quality, significant volume over time. And that has been, that's a very, very challenging requirement to meet when you're a startup company or in scaling. So I think those 3 requirements, or that complexity, is absolutely challenging to meet. But we see now, and of course, as you said, resources, but competitiveness in terms of pricing. So we see there are several novel ingredients that are absolutely accepted, significant research, and can be utilized, but they need to come at a competitive price. And of course, you can accept a premium in a scale up, but it's very challenging when it comes to significant premium. Another thing is also you see the course in terms of moving from novel to scale commodity, and also building data. So trials take a long time to collect the data you need to be approved and to be ready to set. So I think from an industry side, we can definitely approve getting our processes and projects better aligned, so that we can even earlier initiate the conversation in terms of utilizing and implementing novel ingredients. But as I say, to deliver to aquaculture in terms of volumes, quality, and at a competitive pricing, the data required is absolutely the bottlenecks we see.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more on the comments around scale, and it would have been my first response to the question as well. And I think the other part for me that I'd like to raise, and it's a lot easier now that I'm not involved in the nutrition space, but a bit of the elephant in the room for me is the investment for new ingredients from all areas of the industry. So the expectation over the last 15, 20 years, I would say, is that feed companies have been the one that's expected to bring R&D forward, to invest and innovate in new raw materials. But the reality is margins in fish feed have also gone down. I know there's probably a lot of listeners that don't want to hear that. It's banging the same drum that we've been harping on around for the last few years, but there has been an influx of feed supply, and which means it's a more competitive landscape, which means margins have got tighter, and feed companies just simply can't afford to put the same R&D work into what they did historically. So I think, looking at an opportunity of where does the investment come from in the future for alternative ingredients is something that we need to look at. And then I think as well, also the knowledge exchange and or a lack of trust around new ingredients that get introduced. So it's okay as a feed supplier to approach a customer and say, hey, you should use this. It's always, it's always faced with skepticism. Why should I use this? Well, again, where there has been good R&D done, there's been good research around the ingredient, there's been multiple tests around it, we're confident as feed suppliers to be able to put that towards the customers. But there's always, well, do I want to be the first adopter, the early adopter, or what does it mean for my fish in my population, in my environment as well? So decision making has always been slow for new ingredients, largely due to scale, but largely due to hesitation. So I think the education and information piece around new ingredients also needs to be stronger within the industry.
And if I should try to end on a positive note, but because we have to, I think now what you see now, there is momentum, there is a window of opportunity, and what you see now is that, first of all, long-term agreements, third-party agreements, where you together with the customer can collaborate to share the premium in the scale-up phase. That's absolutely something that I think will make a significant difference. And we also see that sense of urgency is creeping up, and it's also driven by government, is also driven by the financial institutions in terms of green loans, obligations towards footprint. So I think there is change in the horizon. I hope so. And definitely the long-term partnerships will have room for more flexibility.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. That was great. Just a quick note to attendees today. I see a couple of questions coming through the chat. If we could just use the Q&A function, that'll help us keep things organized. Having said that, the ones in the chat we can address as well. So speaking of positive notes, speaking of development here, Annette, when you think of the future of these ingredients, what excites you the most?
Well, what I think is really, really good to see is that, so I have to say that my work is very focused on business development. I am in close contact with startup companies, investors, and what I see now, as I described earlier, as a window of opportunity or a change, is I see that second generation startup companies have absolutely learned from the first generations, and they apply the knowledge in terms of quality of the ingredient, but also rooted in sustainability. So sustainability is at the forefront as you see startup companies scaling up to meet the requirements from the industry. So what excites me is to see these very high potential companies. They're not many, but there are some, and I'm really excited to see what we can achieve together.
It's amazing. Thank you very much. Wendy, are there any USDA hot takes you can share with us at this time on upcoming research?
USDA hot takes, no. Wendy hot takes, I would just simply say, for me, I mean, I think in the time that I've been working in this area with alternative ingredients, I think for the longest time early on, we were consistently obsessed with the concept of finding a silver bullet to replace ingredient X. And finally, I feel like the research has turned away from that model. There's still some of that happens, but for the most part, the good research, and there's lots of really good research coming out now that looks at an ingredient based on not a specific replacement, but the value it can bring for whatever application it's best suited for, right? So that's where we're really going to find sustainability, is picking ingredients and using an ingredient as effectively as we can for what it can bring to the table. And that builds in that flexibility that we keep harping on through all these talks, right? Is that understanding we need a complete suite of ingredients and using them for what they are, not what they are trying to replace. And I think that's where we're going to make the most advances, and that's what we're seeing. So that's what gets me excited, is that we have more flexibility than we ever had in that regard. And that's kind of a fun thing to see.
Great. That's awesome. Thank you very much. Well, listen, a little bit of a fun note to end things here. Gareth, you got any good party stories you'd like to share from your work in this space over the years?
There are a few. If we want to narrow it down to one or two, I think it's the laughs that I can have in hindsight over discussions I've had in the industry. There's, again, going back to knowledge exchange and information. As a previous feed supplier, when you approach a customer and it's like, hey, can you give me a price for feed? And you say, look, here you go, conventional diet, let's call it $2,000 a ton. And then they say, well, we're kind of starting up, so I don't think we want land animal proteins in there. So you go, oh, okay, we'll take out the land. Well, I don't think I want GM ingredients in there. Oh, okay, yeah, no problem. And then we've got a choice of forage or trimmings, fish meal, and oil. Okay, I only want trimmings, I don't want forage. Okay, right, okay. Okay, new price for your feed is now $4,000 a metric ton. Like, what? Where did that come from? You're like, guys, go on, shy of feeding your fish air, you need to have something in that diet. And again, when we go back to this discussion, the bigger the basket of raw materials, the better the opportunity of stabilizing costs. So I think, those have always provided some levels of humor, depending on the customer's perspective on that, whether they also found it humorous. But I think that there's a, changing the formulations as well. There's a huge drive for higher digestible energy, more fat in the feed over the last 5 to 10 years. And again, you'd have similar conversations. We're starting at about 35% fat. You good with that? No. 36? No, 37, 38, 30, 40? We're going with 40. Yeah, when do you want it delivered? August. You're like, you're killing me. And then, you get an oil seepage complaint.
Yeah.
I'm doing my best here. I'm doing my best. But again, in hindsight, I could laugh at it now. But at the time, I had more hair for a reason back then, put it that way.
Great. That's great. Well, listen, everyone, we have come to the end of our structured questions section here. We could pivot over to audience questions. So just in this way. None of them are particularly directed at anybody, so I'll pose the questions, and anybody who wants to pipe up certainly can. So, one is there any sort of concerns around microplastics in feed uptake that's being examined in the industry? And it might be one of these areas that we just don't really know anything about yet, too. Very good. All good. Okay, this other person is asking as well, do you use insect protein? They want to know more about kind of what's happening in that space, and bacterial or microalgae proteins as well. Annette, you're nodding your head. I think you might have something to add here.
Absolutely. So these are all categories that we have done a lot of research on, and we know as ingredients. So they are insect and single cell are absolutely brilliant protein sources. And insect has absolutely been utilized for several years. Again, it comes back to competitiveness in terms of pricing. So that's why I say I'm very excited about the second generation, and also in terms of expanding the basket to have more flexibility here. So absolutely well known and perfect ingredients.
Great, thank you very much. The next question here is referring to if anybody has any experience, and again, the answer might be no, but has experience in the use of biologics as a feed and nutrition supplement. Biologics to me means antimicrobials, so I believe that might be what they're getting at, but as a nutrition supplement, I don't know that that's actually what they're aiming at here. Okay, moving on. While we try to replace feed ingredients, can we expect the same taste for fish? This is an intriguing question. I haven't had this one posed before. Have Gareth or Annette or even Wendy, have you guys had any experience with this?
Well, I would just say from a research standpoint that is widely looked at, because we know the importance of the effects of whatever our diet has on end product. If we're feeding humans, we have to make sure that whatever alternatives we're looking at are not significantly altering the end quality of the product we're producing, the fish. And so routinely we in most of our, not most, but in a lot of our alternative ingredient research programs across the country, around the world, they look at food quality at the end. So we'll look at fillet quality, we'll send samples out to taste panels. And I can guarantee you that before any of the companies that have that are working on this thing, they are doing the same thing. That data will be available, or that ingredient will not make it into the market. It's not an issue. So we've seen on the protein side, there's not a significant, in general, if I'm characterizing, there's not a substantial impact on the protein flavor, the effect of a protein ingredient on flavor of the fillet. Most of the flavor changes will occur with the fat component, is what we've seen. There can be some changes in textural components if the formulations are not formulated to account for some of the deficiencies in our alternative ingredients in terms of the protein. So if the feeds aren't formulated correctly, you can see protein effects on fillet quality. But when feeds are formulated for the deficiencies of the, not deficiencies, to balance out for whatever that alternate ingredient is, you can work around those situations. But we always look at that, and I would like the feed companies to verify, but I can't believe that they would ever put an ingredient in without having access to that data. So
no, I can just confirm that food safety, food quality is guiding principle when we work with novels.
Yeah, and thank you for going first on that answer, Wendy. It helped to reaffirm and reassure me what my answer was going to be. But I agree completely. So from data information that I've dealt with in the past, the protein has very little effect on the end taste of the product, but the fat level. So if you feed to a salmon 100% fish oil, you're going to get a fishier tasting fish, is the reality of it. And the type of fish oil you use is going to impact what that is. It's a bit like eating a steak, you know, a lot of the flavor comes through the fat rather than the meat itself. The good thing I would say is that generationally, we've seen a bit of a change in what the consumer likes. Again, speaking on behalf of the salmon industry here, but you know, the generation over generation, people want a less fishy tasting fish. So there's a lot used in sashimi and sushi, etc., that it's much more palatable. So the fact that we've had higher levels of fish oil replacement over the last 10, 15, 20 years has actually, it's done well in terms of correlating with what the needs and the desires are of the consumer as well.
That's great. And that's actually a good point too, just for pro farming, you know, in a lot of my jobs, we are all about supporting the industry here is that, you know, that's a strong ability of farming fish as opposed to say wild capture, is that, you know, we have that sort of level of control in terms of inputs and if we understand what those impacts are on the other end, we can be a little more adaptive to market desire for sure. So okay, the next question here, you discussed the importance of scale and volume when developing these ingredients. And this is an interesting question here. Is there a specific volume you look for when evaluating novel ingredients? And Annette, maybe this is a good question for you. Like, how do you sort of determine whether an ask from a grower warrants the scale of research and investment that's needed?
Ooh, that's a very, very difficult question, to be honest. I know that in the past, there has been mentioned numbers like if you're a protein producer, you need to be at scale to produce 5,000 tons on a yearly basis. But if I can be completely honest, when I see how much we actually utilize in our feed, I think we need to be honest and also rethink our criteria. So actually in our targeting matrix, we try to step away from a very specific volume. And that's also why, because our different diets can require different volumes. So I don't think there is, but of course, as Gareth also mentioned, one thing is it's what our diets required, but also our production facility in terms of silos, availability, and flexibility. So for us, it can be challenging at some sites to handle small volumes, but in other opcos, it can absolutely be possible. So, as I say, we have stepped away, but from having a stand in terms of requirements. But of course, as I say, aquaculture in general, large volumes.
Mm-hmm.
If I could add to that as well, Ben, I think largely this would come down to a commercial response, to be honest. So again, depending on the raw material in question, you know, whether it's included at 0.5% at low levels across everything, you know, 5% or 20%, is it on-grown or hatchery phase? Everything that Annette spoken to, absolutely true. But it then comes down to commercial agreements around exclusivity. So if there's a raw material producer that's speaking with a feed supplier and saying, hey, I have X amount, right, that will suffice 5% in all of your feeds, is that good enough to get over the hurdle and say, okay, but that means you can't sell to anybody else either because you don't have, you know, enough material, or basically that we want to wrap our arms around it and use it as the sole feed supplier of said ingredient. And then it comes back to another point that Annette made earlier around partnerships. So how we partner with how a feed company would partner with a raw material supplier, or how you would partner as a feed supplier with the farming company as well, or potentially all three, to be perfectly honest with you. So I think that it would be a case by case basis, but it would come down to commercial agreements and partnerships.
Great. Well, folks, we have answered all of the audience questions for now. Now, I know we're all very focused on an FCR on a farm, but I think that we've achieved a great TCR, time conversion ratio, in this conversation. And so I will bring us to an end here just a little bit early. If the panelists want to say thank you once again for joining us today, it's been a great discussion and we really appreciate your time today. I'll invite you to turn your video off as we do our outro here, please.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So again, thank you to all the panelists for donating their time today to discuss this topic. As well, I want to thank you viewers for attending today. It's always great to have you here with us. Finally, I once again want to thank OxyGuard, our sponsor, without which this series would not be possible. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day.